Welcome to this week's Walcamp Chapel. My name is Mufasa. If you haven't joined us before, we typically sing a couple songs, so we have a brief meditation followed by a prayer and a couple more songs. Down below, you'll find a link that you can follow to find the lyrics to the songs, or so you can share this chapel with your friends or family members or your classmates. The message this week actually got recorded a month ago. I had it ready to go, and then I switched gears for Advent. So this is a continuation of our story of David. I'm standing here today in Walcamp's mud pit as we continue the story of David. Now, you may recognize some of these verses, you may recognize some of the songs, things that we've used before. The goal of this isn't just to share Bible stories with you and share songs, but the reason we have the Psalms is to go back over and over and over again until they're not just things that we know, but things that we sing and hear in our hearts, ways that we can talk to God when we can't find the words of our own. And so please join me once again in going back to Psalm 40, verse 1. And again, David says this, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and he heard my cry. He lifted me from the slimy pit out of the mud and the mire. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to my God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in God." I will dance and I will sing to be mad for my King. The Lord's tender in his passion in my soul. I will dance and I will sing to be mad for my King. The Lord's tender in his passion in my soul. I'll become even more undignified than this. I'll become even more undignified than this. I will dance and I will sing to be mad for my King. The Lord's tender in his passion in my soul. I will dance and I will sing to be mad for my King. The Lord's tender in his passion in my soul. I'll become even more undignified than this. Some might say it's foolishness, but I'll become even more undignified than this. With my pride by my side, and I'll become even more undignified than this. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. I'll become even more undignified than this. I will dance, I will sing to be mad for my King. Nothing Lord's tender in this passion in my soul. I will dance and I will sing to be mad for my King. Nothing Lord's tender in this passion in my soul. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. He brought my feet out of the pit, out of the miry clay, and I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song. He placed my feet upon a rock, made my footsteps firm. I the Lord. Waiting patiently for the Lord. So today we're finishing up our series on David. We heard how he was anointed by Samuel to be king of Israel. We heard how he served Saul, the current king, even though he was supposed to be king. He didn't rise up against Saul. He was his servant. He served faithfully to Saul, even when Saul accused him of treason and attempted to kill him and made war against David. David ran away. He did everything that he could in order to not harm Saul. And we know that this wasn't cowardice because we hear stories of David with his mighty men going and performing mighty deeds against giants and against unfair odds. And we even see him go into the city of his enemies and live there and fight for them and to serve them with the same faithfulness he gave to Saul, except for not fighting against Israel. And right at the end of our chapel a couple weeks ago, we got to this point where Saul fell in battle along with Jonathan and his other sons, and David is elected the new king of Israel. And suddenly the entire nation is looking for him for what to do. Now we read from the stories that God blesses David and he blesses Israel as a result. We hear later on they consider this the golden age of Israel, the time when God blessed them the best. Everything after this was going to be downhill and trouble. It never reached the height of awesomeness that they had during the time of David. Now, we don't have time to tell the whole story, but there's a couple things that I want to point out. So the first thing that happens is David looks around and he says, I need a palace. He goes to his soldiers, his mighty men, and he says, one of you is going to go and take this city, the city of Jerusalem, the city of peace. I want you to take it from the Jebusites, and whoever does this is going to be the general of my army. And so they do. They find a weakness in the defenses and they storm the city and they take over Jerusalem. And David builds an awesome palace and he sits in the palace and he says, all right, I'm now king of Israel. I'm king of God's people. But God lives in a tent. Now, if you remember in the time of Moses when they were traveling, they built the Ark of the Covenant, holding the Ten Commandments and several other signs and wonders of God's faithfulness to Israel, including Moses' staff. And that was sitting in a tent. Now, it wasn't just in a tent. It had been taken to battle and stolen from the Israelites and brought back from the Philistines. And it was sitting at a tent at the house of a priest, forgotten by the people of Israel. And so David calls Nathan the prophet. He says, Nathan, what should I do? I want to build this palace for God. I want to build him a temple that rivals every other temple in the world because our God is the best. And Nathan says, you're the king, go for it, do it. And God comes to Nathan later and says, no, you didn't even ask me. Go back to David and said, no, it's not your job. And so Nathan goes and he says, oh king, God has another plan. You have too much blood on your hands. You've done too much battle. You've done too much war. You are not the one to build the temple. Your son will build this temple in your place. And David says, well, I can live with that, but I'm going to have everything ready. So he does. He starts getting builders. He starts buying materials. He gets everything ready to build a temple. So when his son finally ascends to the throne, he will have everything that he needs to build a glorious temple for God. And then David decides, well, we need to at least bring God's temple from where it's been forgotten here to the palace, here to Jerusalem, to God's city. And so they do. They send out messengers and they pick up the ark, they put it on a cart and they start driving it. But they forgot to look in the rules and the statutes set forth by Moses on how they needed to treat God's tabernacle, how they needed to treat his seat of judgment. And so bad things happen. He strikes one of them down with a lightning bolt. And the people are afraid. And David mourns. He says, God, why would you do this? And then he goes back. He says, oh, well, God said we have to do it this way and we didn't follow him. So let's do it again. He has the priests carry it on their shoulders the way they're supposed to. They're dressed in the robes of the priest the way they're supposed to be. David takes out his outer garments and he's just dancing around for joy of the Lord as they're bringing this tabernacle into Jerusalem. And it's a day of rejoicing and of celebration. And his wife sees and says, you're the king of Israel. Why would you do this? Why would you make such a fool of yourself? Why do you look so ridiculous in front of the people you're supposed to lead? And David says, this is God. God is coming among us. God lives with us. How could I not do anything but my best to rejoice and to show how grateful I am that God is here? It's not about me. It's not me as a king that's ruling Israel. God placed me here. It's all about God and his glory. Now we read that David was a man after God's own heart, but that didn't mean that he made mistakes either. He made some really large ones as king. he calls for a census. He says, let's count everyone in the land. Let's count the warriors. Let's see how great God has blessed us. And God says, well, remember that little thing over here with Moses where I said, don't do this, because you will trust in your numbers. You'll trust in your soldiers and how many people you can call to battle rather than trusting in God. And so a plague descends on Israel, and David again goes in with sackcloth and ashes and says, God, why would you do this? Please forgive us. Please stop your judgment. David himself does some other things, and he gets in trouble for this and causes a lot of trouble for himself and for the people of Israel later on. But we find that David's relationship with God as king is very different from the relationship that Saul had with him. When God sent Samuel to tell King Saul about his wrongs, Saul justified it. He said, here's why I was right. Here's how I was serving God. When Nathan confronts David, David says, you're right. God is correct. I was wrong. How could I do such a thing? Please forgive me. And so we see two very different forms of leadership here. We see Saul arrogant and wanting to do his way and prove that he was correct. And we see David saying, no, God is correct. Whatever it is, I was wrong. God, please forgive me. Don't take out my mistakes on your people. And God listens and he honors this. Now, David's kingdom up until this time has been one of peace and of triumph and of glory. And afterwards, after these sins, David's told, you're going to be punished and the people of Israel with you. And so we see Israel starts having trouble. We don't see God's blessing in the later parts of King David's life as we did at the beginning. But God still proves himself faithful. God still takes care of David. And finally, near the end of his life, David passes on his mantle of leadership to his son Solomon. And there's disputes. There's several other sons of his who claim the leadership and who rise up armies to prove, hey, I'm the leader. I'm the one that God's chosen. I'm going to be the next king because my father is old and he's not going to be king forever. But David says, no, God has chosen my son Solomon. And so Solomon is going to be the rightful king. And he raises Solomon up to be king of Israel. And so unlike King Saul, who left Israel without an heir, who left Israel kind of floundering, needing someone to rule, David very specifically says, here's who God has called. This is your next leader. And finally, right at the end, David calls Solomon to him. And he says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. This is normal. Nothing to be afraid about or surprised. Be strong. Show yourself. Prove yourself. Keep the charge of the Lord your God. Walk in his ways. Keep his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, just as it was written in the law of Moses. Now we'll come back to the story of Solomon next week, but I want to take a moment to meditate on this part of David's life, the part where he's the king of Israel. We find David called a man after God's own heart, and yet here we are in the mud pit, sitting with David through his mess, through his wrongdoings, through willful disobedience against God, doing things he knows he wasn't right. And what we find is that God didn't call David to be perfect. He said, be like me. But when David fell, God picked him back up and he said, here's where you're wrong. Try again. And so we see that David's a man after God's own heart, not because he's perfect, but because when he's called out on not being like God, he immediately goes back. He spends his life seeking, doing his best to be like God. Now, David didn't have it all figured out. His life wasn't perfect. His family life wasn't perfect. His ability to do his job as king was not perfect. He left a lot to be desired in his life. But the one thing he got right was he sought God in everything that he did. And the great things he praised God. He sang and danced and said, God gets the glory for this, not me. In the worst times, he wasn't afraid to say, I was wrong. I'm the king of Israel, but I was wrong. I made a mistake. This is my fault. And he'd humble himself and say, God, forgive me and restore me again to you. And as we talk about the Psalms, as we hear the songs that David has for us, we learn that these words are for us too. There's days when we're so excited and there's this awesome world around us, we don't know how to say it. And we go to Psalm 8 and we say, oh Lord, how majestic is your name in all of the earth. There's times where we go to, I believe it's Psalm 51. My God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you? I need you. Everything is going wrong. Why can't I find you? And we find Psalm 121. Where does my help come from? From the mountains? No, it comes from God. Psalm 139. Lord, you have searched me and you know me. Where can I go from your presence? Can I go to the east or the west? Can I go to the far side of the sea? Can I even go into the grave, into the depths of the earth? Even the darkness is light to you, Lord. Surely you know me. You know everything about me. And so we find in David's life, not the requirement to be perfect, but an example of a man, a person who can humble himself before God and wants to do everything that in their power to make things right with him again. Pray with me, please. Lord, we stand with you here in your creation, not just on the mountains where we can see your awesomeness and praise you for all the wonders, the stars, the sun, the moon, everything that you've created. But we can come here into the depths, into the mud, where we feel stuck, where we feel trapped, where we feel dirty, where nothing seems to be going right, where we can't do anything on our own. And we can still praise you because we know that you reached down and you love us enough to meet us here in this place and to bring us out. And so we ask that you would transform our hearts to be like David, who took your word and he followed it and he said, I am wrong, let me be like you. Rather than to be like Saul to say, well, I could have done better, or you didn't give me enough, or, well, you were taking too long and you gave me this power and I used what you gave me. Teach us to follow you. Teach us to look for you wherever we are. And may we always find you in that place. Be with us today, every day. Amen. In the soundless awe and wonder, words fall short to hope again. How beautiful, how vast your love is, new forever, world without an end. In the soundless awe and wonder, words fall short to hope again. How beautiful, how vast your love is, new forever, world without an end. In the soundless awe and wonder, words fall short to hope again. How beautiful, how vast your love is, new forever, world without an end. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. May the Lord hear you always and walk with you, today and every day. Go in peace.